Let's do one more set. Let's try this list. All right, now write down what you remember there. So these were the two lists that I showed you. You'll notice they're both 12 letters. They're both the same letters, just in different orders. Which list was easier for you to remember? I'm gonna guess the second one, and here's my prediction why. So in the first list, the letters are all kind of jumbled, right? So in essence, you're needing to remember 12 individual bits of information, 12 letters. But in contrast, the list on the right had some recognizable acronyms and initialisms, right? So instead of needing to remember a C separately from an I and an A, you could think about this as the three-letter CIA. So instead of needing to remember 12 bits of information, you only need to remember 4 pieces of information. So this is a cool example of what we call chunking. So this is a process of grouping similar or meaningful information together so that it's easier to remember. And we do this literally all the time. This is why, for instance, our phone numbers are often divided into chunks of 3 to 4 letters split by dashes. This is true of your social security number as well. And it can be true for non-numbers. It can be true for words too. So for instance, say this was your grocery list that you needed to obtain these items at the store. Now, instead of needing to remember these 7 items, you could chunk them into meaningful groups. So maybe you group these into sandwich makings and the bottom into fruit. Then you only need to remember 2 things instead of the 7. So it's a useful way of maintaining more things in your short-term memory. Now, the short-term memory, the information that you attend to in your short-term memory really can only stay for a maximum of 30 seconds, unless you rehearse it more, unless you spend more time working on it. So rehearsal is the repetition of information, and it helps information stay in your short-term memory for longer. It can actually stay in your short-term memory indefinitely if you keep rehearsing it, but you can't think of anything else in between. As soon as you think of other things, this will start to disappear. Now, it's a very active process, though. It's like repeating numbers over and over again, 614, 614, that kind of thing, or how Dory repeated the address she was trying to remember in Finding Nemo. So your brain's got to work for it in order to get this. And whatever it doesn't rehearse or whatever it doesn't practice gets lost. Now, after researchers had studied memory a little bit more, the idea of working memory emerged. So this is an extension of the concept of short-term memory. You can think of working memory as like a special case of short-term memory, but to be honest, it's often used pretty synonymously, the two words. So working memory includes actively manipulating multiple items simultaneously. So this idea came from the observation that participants could manage 2 different short-term memory tasks at once. So for instance, if I gave you a list of numbers to remember, and then I asked you to read a paragraph, you can hold those numbers in your mind while simultaneously reading and putting cognitive resources into a different task. So this suggests that there must be an ability to work with different types of information simultaneously. So here's kind of a way you can differentiate the two, although again, they're kind of overlapping a lot. Whereas short-term is kind of more passive storage of information, you can rehearse it, but maybe you're doing less effortful activity with it. Working memory is more of that active manipulation. So it's more actually adding numbers together or doing just mental calculations, that kind of thing. Short-term memory is typically one process at a time. So I asked you to remember that list of 12 letters. That was the thing you were doing. Whereas working memory often involves multiple processes simultaneously. After some exploration, they learned that There are different types of information that can be processed in working memory. In fact, 4 different components that are unique. The first thing that researchers discovered is what we call a phonological loop. So this is memory for verbal and auditory information. So for instance, if you hear me say a set of words or a set of numbers, and you're repeating them over and over in your head, trying to remember either like verbal or auditory information, you're using your phonological loop part of your working memory. Now, the second part of working memory is what we call a visuospatial sketchpad. So this holds, as you could maybe guess, visual and spatial information instead. So for instance, if you had to describe your route from your dorm room to a classroom or to the dining hall, you could picture this route as if you were sketching it out in your mind without forgetting other words you had to memorize or whatnot, because it's a different system of your working memory. Now we also have what we call an episodic buffer. So episodic buffer is going to combine information from your long-term memory, which we'll talk about in a second, with the things you're actively working on in your working memory. So this is why, for instance, chunking works, because we're not only using our working memory to remember the chunks, but we needed information from our long-term memory to apply a meaning to each chunk. And then lastly, the fourth thing is what we call the central executive. Now, the central executive manages all of the other components, and it delegates attention to what is needed at that particular time. So let's say you needed to use the phonological loop in your sketchpad. Your central executive is then going to allocate the right amount of attention that you need to each of those components. Now, we know from studying different individuals with brain damage that the central executive seems to be all throughout the frontal lobe. There's not one general, executive CEO in the front of your mind or anything, but it seems to be managed by several parts in our frontal lobes.